Hello, and welcome back to this tutorial on using TailwindCSS grid layout with grid utility classes. Grid layout is a powerful way to arrange elements in rows and columns, providing greater control over alignment, sizing, and positioning compared to traditional layout methods. Let's look at how to create grid columns. This is a list of numbers that has different colors, and I used a custom CSS called Grinder so that it will give me some CSS properties, that is paddings, rounded edge, text center, and text black. To turn these elements to grid, we put in the utility class grid, and we use grid calls calls class to decide the number of grid we want to have. If I say grid calls 2, you see it is divided into a 2-column layout, and grid calls 3 divides it into 3-column layout. Grid calls can run up to 12, as you can see it illustrated here. And let's just put grid calls 3. So we have a 3-column layout. This 3-column layout stays this way all through different breakpoints. If you want to change this behavior, you can make it responsive. Let's do a 2-grid layout. We'll say that it is at the SM breakpoint that it should be 2-grid layout. So right now it is 1-grid layout at this breakpoint, but the moment it gets to SM breakpoint, it changes to 2-grid layout. And you can also change as much as you want. You can go to, say, when it is at MD breakpoint, it should be 3-grid layout. And so you see here at the small mobile layout, it is 1-grid layout, and at SM it becomes 2, and as we move on, it becomes 3-grid layout. You can also use row instead of columns. We'll create a grid layout, and this time we'll say grid rows. Let's make it 3 rows. But you see nothing changes here because we haven't specified how we want it to flow. We're going to come here and say grid flow in the column direction. It has row 3, and then it flows in the column direction. When we change this to 4, you see we have 4 rows. The other items flows in the column direction. If you change it to 5, it's going to change to 5 rows, and then it flows in the column direction. As you would notice, all the grids are put together. They are not spaced. Let me put in another list. I'm going to return it to calls 3. You can use the gap spacing class to give it some spacing. So just say gap, and then to have a spacing for X and Y axis, you can do gap 1. Gap 1 puts about 4 pixel margin around each grid item. Gap uses this syntax, and you can also specify only the horizontal axis or the vertical axis. So we can say only for X. So you say gap dash X dash 1. So you see it's only the horizontal axis that has a gap, and you can do for Y axis only, and you can do both. X axis is 3 and Y axis is 1. All items in your grid does not have to occupy only one space. You can span the item by using the grid span classes. We can span columns or rows using this syntax, that is column and then the span size, and you can also do that for rows. So let's put in another example. This time I want the first item to span 2 of the grids. So what you do is you come to the first item and we say column span 2. You can see it spans from the first column to the second column. And you're not limited to only column span. You can also do row span. Let's say we want to span this row, a row 3 to span to row 6. So we come here and say row span 2. That is, we want it to span through 2 of the rows. For column span 2, it spans 2 of the columns, and column span, row span 2 is span 2 of the rows. Let's make this 3 so you can see the difference. For the row, it spans 3 of the rows. Let's add another span for the item 02. So I say column span dash 2. You will see because we have just one column here and it needs 2 columns to span, it spanned it and brought this down. When there is no space to span to, it naturally floats to the next row. If this is the behavior you want, such that you have the space remaining here, then you can leave it this way. But you might want to condense or put it all together so that it looks more fitted. In such an instance, On the parent div where you specify the column, you're going to come and say grid flow. We've done grid flow columns before. You can say grid flow dense. And with grid flow dense, it compacts it all together so that you wouldn't have a space in between the grid. There may be instances where you don't want the first grid to start at the beginning. So you might want to shift it a little bit. To do this, we use the column start and end classes to make that happen. You say column start and then a number, the number you want to shift to. So let's try that. In this, I'm going to say col-start-2. It will move every other thing and it will start from the second column. Column start and end is another way of spanning your element across columns, but this time it's not going to occupy the whole columns that you specify. If you say column 2, it's going to retain its size but moves to the second column. And you can also use end. Let's say in this list 8, you can say column end. Let's move to 3 columns, and you see now at 7 is supposed to be 8 here, 9, and then 10. But now it has moved 2 more columns, and then 8 is starting at this point. You can use start2 to start at the second column, and also you can combine it with span to span from the second column to the third column. So what you're just going to do is say call span 2. That is, from where it is, it should span 2 columns. Call start and end and call span enables you to decide the placement position of each item in the grid. In our next video, we will talk about grid alignment using Tailwind's utility classes.